Welcome to Status Check with Spivey, where we talk about life, law school admissions, a little bit of everything. Today, we're going to talk about interviewing, mostly law school admissions interviewing, but I would say that a lot of this advice carries over. I've spent a good deal of my time interviewing people and even reading some of the literature on interviewing and what makes a successful interview. Is very much universalizable. How you relate to the interviewer, how much confidence without grandiosity you have, your ability to tell your story with calm composure. All these things, believe it or not, translate higher than the skills and experience you bring to the table in general in both admissions, decision-making, and hiring. I'm joined by Karen Buttenbaum, my business partner. She was the first person I hired, brought over to Spivey Consulting. She was at Harvard Law School as their director of admission. She had been there for 12 years, and in part of that 12 years, Karen helped found the interview program at Harvard. So I thought she would be a great person to have this discussion with. Believe it or not, back in the day, Harvard interview requests were called KB1s, and then the acceptance call, if you got one, was called KB2s. So Karen and I discuss all things law school admissions interviews. It's a little bit nuanced and a little longer than our normal podcast, as is this introduction. So without further delay, let me hand it over to our conversation. Hi, this is Mike Spivey, and I'm joined with one of my business partners, Karen Buttenbaum, who was the director of admission at Harvard before she joined Spivey Consulting. And I believe, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, but you may have taken the charge in starting the interview process at Harvard. Is that accurate?
I did. Yeah. I was there when it started. I was not the one in charge of it, but we started with phone interviews. So it was before Zoom or Skype was popular, and we randomly called people, which was interesting.
Did they know they were being called?
No. And for the first year we did it, we did not. I know, talk about not
These
being
kids got it easy.
not being aware of how admissions offices stress applicants out.
Right.
There's no self-awareness there.
Well, we should start a consulting arm. Like, how much does your school stress these poor applicants out? And
Right.
I'd go back in time and visit you. I'm curious what percentage would answer the call. And would you leave a voicemail saying, hey, this is Karen Buttenbaum from Harvard?
Yeah, we did. You know, a lot of people weren't expecting the phone calls because the phone call to be admitted was fairly new as well. So it wasn't, known that a phone call from a 617 area code meant anything. It was actually a high percentage of people who answered the phone as opposed to the number of people who screen their calls today. I mean, this is back in, I think, 2005, 2006, before a lot of the chat rooms, a lot of the stuff that is information spreading these days.
Speaking of admit calls, remember that applicant you called and admitted, and the first thing he did was said, "Mom!"
No, that was actually at the end. At the end of the call, he was like very calm about it. That's one of my favorite stories. He was very calm throughout the whole call. I was like, congratulations, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, okay, thank you very much. And as he went to hang up the phone, I could hear him
He thought
going,
he was off. Yeah, he thought it was disconnected. Why did you all start it at Harvard? And maybe that's applicable for a lot of schools. I was at Vanderbilt when we started interviewing too, so I can shade in my side too. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a different way to get to know an applicant. You see everything on paper. You see a lot of information about the person. So it's a different way to see people, to have a conversation with somebody. It's a different dimension that you can see. But it's also a way to see how that person interacts with other human beings. I mean, everything is on paper in a pre-interview application, but here you get a chance to see how somebody answers questions. And so you can get to see how self-aware they are, how socially awkward they are, which is kind of cute because sometimes being a little socially awkward.
Right. Is a bonus if you're talking about Harry Potter for 2 minutes versus 10. It's a plus. Yeah.
Right. But I mean, I think career services had an interest in interviewing as well, because there's a dimension of the application that includes employability. And this was during the time where it may have been difficult, or it's starting to get difficult on the back end of law school for employment purposes. So it's just, another dimension of the applicant that you can only get in a face-to-face kind of interview.
The other context I'd provide is you probably know well because you and I lived this is years ago. Northwestern was the first school that interviewed.
Oh, yeah.
What you probably may not know because you were in your mighty Ivy Tower at Harvard is that the year after they interviewed, they saw a dramatic increase in applications. And here's my theory why. jerks like me who think they're like cool are like, oh, well, my GPA is a 2.9 and I have a lower LSAT, but I can talk my way into Northwestern. When I applied to business school, I was like, just give me an interview and I'm set. I mean, that was my, ridiculous mindset. So I think that schools were able to also see that Northwestern had that effect, that increase in number of, and when you're in law school, you want the more applicants, the better. So I do think that some schools initiated interview protocols to just get more applicants, but there's always this backdrop of, is someone going to nail it? Or conversely, maybe even more so, is someone going to flub it so bad that they're not going to be clicked on this, employable? But that's the extremes, the 10% and the 10%. The 80% in the middle were probably selected because they have a good shot at being admitted, right? I'm sure you would echo this. A school doesn't have the resources to interview everyone. You probably have data to back that up.
Yeah, I mean, I think every school does it differently. There are some schools that let anyone interview, and then there are some schools that selectively interview. Some schools randomly interview.
Right.
I think it's good to know that if you're, to the schools that you're applying to, because if you're not selected for an interview at some schools, it means nothing. And in some schools, it means more. So like Chicago and Harvard, for example, both started interviewing around the same time. I think actually the same year.
By chance, or did you happen to see Ann Perry?
I think it was by chance. Yeah. I mean, Ann had told me about it. I remember telling her, and I think that it was Toby at the time was thinking about it. So yeah, anyway. So like, for example, at the schools that you need the interview in order to be admitted, they're gonna interview more people than they can possibly admit. So just by the virtue of the numbers, let's say that a school gets 8,000 applications, they're gonna interview between 12 and 1,500. So those people who are selected to interview are obviously the top of the pool, and it's a comparative process. So that's always part of the thinking that goes into it. But from that pool, let's say they're going to admit 900 or around 900, 950. Automatically, there are some people in that pool that are just not going to make it. But the majority of people do. So the numbers schools don't usually release those numbers, but that's good to know so that you know where you fall.
I would double click on the majority of people interviewed are admitted at many schools. I think that's good for people to know.
Yeah.
I mean, it is an evaluative comparative process. We have a wonderful podcast with Dr. Gabor Mate that sort of blew up as far as people from all over the world listening to it. But he talks a lot about how we live in an evaluative comparative society, and that adds so much stress in our lives. If you're about to interview and you're stressed, one way to think of it is, hey, I'm here. I made it past round one, right, and they probably want to admit me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, or they're leaning in that direction.
Right.
I definitely don't want people to believe that if you're interviewing and then you don't get admitted at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily mean you blew the interview.
We'll talk a little bit later about how people can blow it, but you're right.
Yeah, but I think at the end of the day, your paper application, air quotes, the paper,
right.
Paper application.
You're dating yourself, Buttenbaum.
I know I am. The paper application is one part of it. And then there's the conversation or the interview part of it is another part of it. But at the end of the day, it's the application as a whole, all of those elements as a whole that are going to get the final decision. It's not just on one piece of it or the other. I mean, that's for the schools who you need the interview.
What do you think is more important, the application? If you had to say, okay, I'm answering for all schools, which is more important, the application or the interview, or are they equal?
That's tough. I'm gonna have to say the application.
I was gonna say the same thing. I mean, the application is probably more important, but certainly if you have a disastrous interview, right, it doesn't matter. Or if you just really connect with your interviewer, you can override a weaker application. But if you have a weaker application, you're probably not getting the interview.
Exactly. Right. There are different schools interview for different reasons, but if you're getting invited to interview, then your application is already strong. And I think part of what people don't realize, and I didn't realize this before I worked at Harvard, is how strong these applicants pools are. And I'm not just talking about Harvard, I'm talking about all these schools.
Oh yeah, I was at Vanderbilt, WashU in Colorado. So that's 16 and 40 something. And the applicants were just as strong at Colorado as they were at Vanderbilt. Right. No different.
And it's a comparative process. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with your application. It just means that there were other applications that were selected first. And that language is exact from a boss of mine and yours.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. He
Well,
always used to say that.
yeah, he would spend a lot of time thinking carefully about the words he would say. So we'll dive in quickly soon into like things people can do to help themselves in the interview. I just want to hit on one other phenomena I've noticed because I'm curious if you've noticed this. You would expect that more often than not, people who say I'm bad at interviewing or post interview, I don't think I did well in that interview, would be the ones who didn't do well. I find it's the exact opposite. And this is the Grandiosity Terry Real podcast we did. It's the people that say, I'm so awesome at interviews, I got this, that tend to be the ones that do the worst on interviews. Not always, of course.
I mean, one of the elements of an interview that is being evaluated is how self-aware are you?
Right.
And I think sometimes if somebody thinks they're so great, they're not aware of any flaws that they might have. And so that may come across differently. I tend to see a lot of people who, especially clients who I've talked to, and I know that they can have a conversation. I know that they can be anxious, but at the same time, they can still muddle through a conversation. I think they tend to get the most worried about it. But
Right.
I know they're going to be okay because it's about who you are as an individual. And I've had conversations with you before. I know how you speak to people. Like, this is okay. But after the interview, they'll be like, it went great. And then, like, maybe the next day, they'll be like, I've been thinking about it.
A lot of those tells. I just think that overt insecurity or shyness is totally fine. I just want you to know, Dean Buttenbaum, I'm a little nervous because Harvard's always been my dream school. That's a perfect statement. I think covert insecurity, oh, I just got off my cell phone with someone on a private jet. I'm glad we could make time for this Zoom. You can think of how rampant that is in law school, that mentality. Because people are forced to hide their insecurities, so they mask them in grandiosity. That is what I think shows up more as the sort of the negative in the interview process.
Right, and it comes across as arrogance.
100%. Most people are overly worried, but the good news is if you're overly worried, you're going to do fine. The bad news is if you're ready to kill it, you might not. I'm kidding, because I think there's also something to be said for calm, coolness, and confidence. Just don't overdo it. Let's talk about preparation, because my philosophy on preparation is the people that over prepare do poorly, because a school can ask you essentially an infinite number of questions.
Absolutely.
And if you're going through a database of former questions and trying to script an answer for everyone, you're probably not going to have a very good interview. I think, to me, the best way to prepare is know about yourself, know about the school. And I know you're going to talk about why law, know about why you want to go to law school. In general philosophical terms, to me, anyone who scripts an answer is setting themselves up for failure. The only speech I ever gave when I used to public speak a lot, COVID kind of ended that for a bit, that I wrote out was the speech I bombed.
Oh, yeah. I always tell my clients, there's a couple tips that I have. One is if you have, sample questions somewhere, if you're going to write stuff down, if you feel the need to write stuff down, do it in bullet points so that you're not scripting out sentences. But even taking a step back from that, try to understand why they're asking the questions that they're asking. The things that schools are looking for in the interview, obviously, can you answer a question that is asked? Like, that's really important. Like, do you have basic skills to answer the question that is asked? But also, how well thought out is the decision to go to law school? Like, they may be asking questions about that. Like, for example, if you're coming straight from college, be prepared to answer the question, why now? Just make sure that you have a well thought out answer to why you're going to law school. So they may be asking different types of questions that get at that. How self-aware are you? How well do you know yourself? So the questions that might be about what are your dreams, or what are your strengths, and what are your areas of improvement? They're all trying to get at how well do you know yourself? And then another category is how nicely do you play with others? There's a lot of questions out there about how you interact with other human beings. So questions like, how do you deal with difficult situations, or those kinds of questions.
What's an example of? That would be a classic, right?
Exactly. And then, of course, school-specific questions like, why do you want to go to this law school? But those are the big buckets that I think of when I think of what types of questions the school will be asking. And so when you start the preparation at the why are they asking these questions, it makes it easier to answer. For example, there's a lot of questions out there that are about interactions with others or, being self-aware. I always tell my clients to put your HR hat on. Think about what HR is trying to get at, those type of, developmental exercises that HR is always trying to get you to do. How do you deal with, if you're working with somebody who's difficult to deal with, how do you work with them? Or if you're working on a project together with a group of people, how do you organize them to, get an end product? HR would say, or an HR type answer would be something along the lines of everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses and being aware of where everyone can contribute to a team project, just being aware of yourself and how you interact with others around you.
Right. I would say that also, everything true. The way you used to start your interviews your first year at Harvard was, so how's it going? You literally can't prepare for that. Be confident in going slowly. You'd be surprised, since you've known me for 20 something years, how when I'm talking to a president of a university or a Gabor Mate person, how slowly I can start talking, because if I'm analyzing my words to the question, like, so how's it going, that I'm not expecting. And if you talk slowly and go slow, one thing I've learned in the last 5 years, no one seems to care or matter. When the media is interviewing me and I'm going really slowly, they're not like speeded up. I think they would rather a mindful, thought out answer. This is why I bring this up. The younger version of me thought it was impressive to always snap off an answer. And now the older version of me, progressively older, realizes I don't have to snap off an answer. It's much better to have a slow, well thought out answer. And I know a lot of people fumbled over your early question. So how's it going?
The question actually was, what's been taking up your time recently? I don't work there anymore, so you're probably not going to get that question. But
right.
But it's, just kind of like, how are things going kind of question. When we were talking about being scripted, I think that when I was interviewing people, if they sounded overly scripted in their answer, like if they sounded like they were reading a full sentence, I would often just throw them a curveball.
Yes, that's good for applicants to know, for sure. The more scripted you are, the more likely the person's going to try to throw you off script. The more organic you sound, the more it's going to be a 10 to 15. And this is an important data point too. Mm-hmm. A 10 to 15 to 17-minute organic conversation generally means you did really well. That's like, to me, that's the sweet spot of time. These are busy people. They're not going to give you an hour. There's no way they're going to give you an hour. They're giving you an hour. You have a very complicated character and fitness thing. They want to admit you, but you're bumbling that thing up, I'm going to guess. So again, please don't feel like you have to come in prepared to answer any possible question on the planet. Just come in with a certain amount of calm, slowness, and confidence. Would you say business casual?
Absolutely, especially if you're going to be on camera.
Not like we are today, but it is 6 a.m.
Definitely be professional. I would even say business, because you can't be overdressed for an interview.
Yeah, because if the person on the other side is dressed in business, then you're going to be insecure.
Don't wear a tux or a ball gown. But you really can't be overdressed.
Unless you're going to reference my cousin Vinny, then wear a purple stuff. Right. Speaking of purple, you know who this person is. I'm not going to say their name. They ended up going to Penn Law. This is like year 2 of Spivey Consulting. When they interviewed for Northwestern, they painted the back of their wall in purple. Do you remember that?
I remember that. Yeah.
This is the nth degree people will go to get a competitive advantage. And he didn't say, he wasn't like, hey, I painted my wall, because that would have been, he was smart enough to know that would have been too much. He just let the wall be purple.
Right. This is before the time of ring lights and all the videos and good lighting on videos. And I think this applicant even consulted a makeup artist to make sure that they looked good.
So, you can disagree to stuff. And obviously he did fine. He got into a great law school with some significant character and fitness stuff from 7 years ago. But this is a point I always have noticed. The people that nth degree every little minor details, but during their interaction with the law school don't make it seem like they did, are the people who do well. The people that worry about every little minor detail and then worry when they interact with the law schools are the people who don't do well. I have no qualms about clients of ours when I speak to them. Do I parking spot 1A or 1B? This is as nuanced as it gets, and people can sometimes plan out every little detail. But my point is, it's okay to park in 1A if you think getting 2 steps closer to the door quicker is better, but just don't show that side of you during the interview. Anna Hicks will remember a client of ours last cycle, who I think is at Stanford, who, to her credit, she worried about the humidity of the day of the campus visits, but she wouldn't show that to the admissions officer. So she did well. Okay. So you're in the interview, you're in your business or business casual. I think either one is generally fine. Your backdrop looks great. What are some advice you have? Why law? Why our school? Tell me something challenging about this happened in your life. What are some general tips you have?
Most people don't know whether or not the person interviewing them has read the application. You don't know if the interviewer has read your application. The takeaway here is assume that they haven't. Assume that they have some basic information about your application, some detailed notes from the previous reader, your basic information like LSAT score, GPA, where you went to school, how long ago you graduated, and probably your resume. But the person you're actually interacting with may not have read your application. I say all of that because when you're answering the why law question, it is absolutely okay to repeat what you've written in your personal statement.
Right.
You don't want to waste time in an interview saying, "Did you read my personal statement?"
Yeah, you would never want to say that. It's aggressive.
You'd be surprised how many people ask me that.
Let's just be technically precise. The person interviewing you is going to know things about you 100%.
Absolutely.
But for internal validity purposes, and the school may say, we don't want your file reader to be your interviewer. So the person interviewing you may be going off notes from a separate file reader.
Exactly.
If it's the dean of admission, I mean, I know it's going to be the answer is it depends, but in some cases, they're paying particular attention to something. In other cases, it's just a random lottery.
Yeah, it could be just a scheduling thing because you never know if somebody is sick one day and can't do their scheduled interviews.
I just always tell applicants, if you get the dean of admission and you know it's coming, well, that's the person that can literally pull a lever the easiest to admit or deny. So, although I'm a pretty confident person, to me, it's good that the dean of admission would be interviewing me.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases it is. I wouldn't want to read too much into it just in case it's not. But I definitely think that it's more common now to have a team of interviewers rather than the dean of admissions themselves doing the interview.
Yeah, for sure. When we started this, it was KB1 and KB2. Your initials 1, your initials 2. Now there's a whole team. I know that the dean of admission at Harvard has gone out of her way to make sure it's not KJ1, KJ2. To her credit, she wants it to be a team effort. Yeah. Tips for questions.
So the why law question is often difficult for people to think about in the interview question. So I came up with a formula that I think is helpful. It's not scientific or exact, but the formula for answering the why law question is 80% of your answer should be what got you to this place. And I say that because a lot of people spend time in their why law question talking about what they want to do in the future. And what you want to do in the future should probably only be about 10% of your answer, because at this point, it's all fiction. You really want to talk about your accomplishments, what led you to this place, and that should be the absolute bulk of your answer. Sure, you should, if you have an idea of what you want to do, some practical application of the law degree, an acknowledgement that the law school isn't the end of your career. That should be mentioned as well. And then the remaining 10% is some form of that you like it or you'd be good at it. There has to be some element of that in there. And it's usually part of kind of what brought you to this place, but just make sure that that piece is in there as well. So that's my unscientific formula.
No, I like it. I mean, I came up with a formula that my stress fracture boot reduces 60% of the impact to my stress fracture. And I just made up that number. Yours is a little more scientific. I think hyperspecificity isn't necessarily bad. I'm going to law school because I want to be the commissioner of the NBA. I've actually heard that 3 times in my career, which is bizarre, but it has to follow with, but I understand things change and life change. And that's a very difficult position to come by. So I'm open to a lot of other things. So you can be hyper specific, but as long as you also have a disclaimer. I want to be a faculty member, but I understand that that's not an easy path. And some people do that and some people change their mind. I'll go to big law, but I understand that some people burn out. When you watch true professionals in this world, including all these podcasts we've had with these experts, they don't speak in absolutes. They're always disclaiming. Other advice for questions that come up often.
So the why this school question, kind of a formula to that too. But I always say focus on 3 things. You don't want to go beyond 3 things. You don't want to, just have this laundry list of reasons you want to go to that school. So think of 3 bullet points of things you want to stress about the school. I usually say the first one should be something academic. I mean, you're applying to an academic program. That's the whole point. You're applying to a school. So there has to be a, educational reason that you want to attend that school. If you're having trouble organizing, this is a way to organize it. Think of something academic, think of something cultural. It could be two things academic and one thing cultural. Or if you're thinking about the school because of the location, that is absolutely acceptable too. But I think it probably should be the last thing, just in terms of, orders of priority. That's kind of how I think about it. But I would always limit it to, three things. So you're not blathering on.
I have a hack if you want to hear it.
Yeah, yeah.
This is how I got my 4.3. I didn't know I had a 4.3 law school GPA because I took one class and I did obviously 4.3 well, but it was a Vanderbilt law class. All three L's. It was a seminar of about 12 people. I was probably the least intelligent and by far the least law savvy person in the class. I hadn't had a 1L or a 2L. So I went into that class just assuming I was going to have the lowest grade in the class. So all I did, Karen, is I wrote down word for word. And again, this is many, many years ago. I wrote down word for word what the instructor said. And on the final exam, I just told them their opinion back to them. Point being this is actually, I think, a really instructive point other than me bragging about how great I think my law school GPA is. If the law school signals what's important to them, and many do, it forms fairs on their website, on their webinars, don't be afraid to tell them back to them, particularly if it resonates with you. Oh, I like your small environment and, a small town. If that's important to them and it's important to you, that's like Journal of Human Resources 101. I mean, when those things overline in symmetry, they're going to like you. Put it another way, they've been saying that for 8 years of their career. I like working at this small school, Princeton Law School, because I like being in Princeton, New Jersey, a small town feeling. If you say that back to them in your own words, they're going to really like it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. And I think it's important to think about this differently than the essay, because that's almost exactly what we tell people not to do.
Not to do, right?
Why essay?
It would be so obvious, right?
So answering the why this school in the interview is different than the why essay. But if you did do a why essay for the school where you're interviewing, it's totally okay to repeat, the same elements of why you're interested in that school.
My dad was going to be on 60 Minutes once. And so they had like a PR firm come in and like prep him. And they said, like, say the same thing over and over again and you're fine.
Yeah.
But he did it to such an obnoxious level, 60 Minutes never aired his age. Just had one line. It's okay to reinforce what you said. I mean, you've probably done day-long interviews. Everyone who's listening to this podcast will, not everyone, but the vast majority will eventually do a day-long interview. Those are the weirdest phenomena because you're saying the same thing over and over all day long because people are asking you the same question, but they're different people. So you have a good answer, use it. And if you had a good why essay, use your why essay in just an organic conversational piece.
Right. And it's the same thing about, if you included why you want to go to law school in your application materials somewhere, then it's okay to reinforce that when you're asked that question in an interview. You're the same person. You should have the same reasons for wanting to do things. So it's perfectly okay.
I was thinking about other common interview questions, and the thing that flashed in my mind wasn't questions. It's that so much of these interviews, because I was thinking about how Georgetown would give you like a hypothetical 3 applicants and you can only admit 1 or whatever they used to do. If a school's giving you 3 hypothetical applicants, if they're doing it well, it doesn't matter which one you pick. It's how you talk through the process of your picking. There's no wrong answer. Here's the thing I think is so important for people listening to this. If you're applying to law school, in the vast majority of interview questions, they're either asking you about yourself or your aspirations. There's literally no wrong answer. It's how you answer the question, which I think you hit on at the very beginning of our conversation. How well thought out are you?
Yep, exactly. It's how self-aware are you? How you handle things is really up to you. I mean, I think there can be some better ways to answer the question. I think you're absolutely right. But I think in terms of how you interact with others, there can be best practices in terms of how you interact with others or how well you know yourself. Just think about those kinds of things when you're answering a question. Again, thinking about why are they asking this question and then answering it appropriately.
Right. If we've covered enough, and I think we have, can you think of any non-standard questions that come to mind?
A lot of schools will ask when you're talking to a human, not the pre-recorded ones necessarily, but a lot of schools will ask questions about you. So one of the things I tell my clients to do is to go back over your resume. Even though you've done all that stuff, the interviewer might latch on to something on your resume and ask you about it. I remember when I was interviewing, I spent a lot of time asking somebody about one of their interests because they played the bagpipes. Not at all what they expected me to ask about, I'm sure. Things about jobs that you've had or experiences that you've had. Just think of those experiences and make sure that you remember what you wrote about in your application. And, if you wrote a thesis or something like that, one of the questions I asked a lot was, tell me about your thesis. Most of the time, I had no idea what their topics were because there were things that were way over my head. But I would ask them questions like, did anything surprise you as you were doing research for your thesis? Or, did you have any findings that were surprising to you or something like that?
Right.
And, sometimes they'd be like, are you familiar with quantum physics? And I would have to say, assume I am not.
Right. Let's, for the sake of pretend, say no.
Right. For the purposes of this interview, assume I am not.
Right.
So, I think there are definitely personalized things that can come up that the applicant may not be prepared for, but they're questions about them. So they should know those answers.
So, Karen, I'm going to ask you a difficult question because I think any question that's about you, tell me about playing the bagpipes, tell me about stealing home that you had in your personal statement. Probably don't write a personal statement about stealing home base. But any question about you, in theory, should be pretty easy. You know yourself, the interviewer doesn't. Just be truthful and honest and mindful. Let me ask you a tough question. For the record, I haven't read your application, but I have seen the outline of your application. I see that you have one DUI from 2 years ago in your character and fitness section. Can you just tell me what happened that night?
Yeah, that throws me because
You don't have a DUI.
I don't have a DUI.
Right.
So how I would answer that, yeah, I would probably own up to it and say, I made a huge mistake. It was something that I am ashamed of and regret. I haven't done anything like that since and will never do that again.
Right. I think that's perfect. The way you just answered it, I would say there's an incredibly high percentage of likelihood they wouldn't ask you a follow-up. If it was you didn't hit anything, the police officers pulled you over. The reason why I asked you that question for everyone listening is lots of people have character and fitness stuff in their background. It could come up on the interview. You don't have to give a 6-hour thesis on it starting at noon. I went to a football game and I saw people drinking around me and it looked fun. You can just say, like Karen said, I take ownership of it. It was a night in the life I will never forget and I regret, but it also will never happen again. It almost can be that quick.
I think it should be that quick, really. You don't need to know what the circumstances were.
That's the time to look into the camera directly. If you're ever going to look up or down, not then, look at the person.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about how to do the interview process? How do you wrap them up?
So sometimes you're given the opportunity to ask a question at the end. So as the applicants are, getting ready to wrap up, because some of these are really short and they go by quickly.
Yeah, 7 to 15 minutes is the norm, I would say.
Yeah. Right. Some of them are a little bit longer, but, I'd say 15 minutes. Don't get freaked out if it's only 7 minutes.
Exactly. It might mean they love you. It might mean they're checking a box that says admit.
Or they could just simply be running late, which isn't, that's not fun and it seems unfair, but life is unfair.
I think it's incredibly important for applicants to realize that your typical professional, and many applicants are too, in the professional world has a very busy day.
Right.
And I used to go to law firms and meet with managing partners and hiring partners of these big law firms. And in year one, I would bring faculty members who are experts in the field. So I would go to Cravath in New York City and I'd be meeting with their hiring partner who practiced environmental law. And I would bring an environmental faculty law with me. I realized very quickly that was a horrible idea because most faculty members couldn't see that minute on the hiring partner's face where they totally checked out because they were worried about their clients.
Yeah.
And that could come at the 15-minute or the 20-minute mark or the 7-minute mark. I would say this is really important. Be aware of the subtle cues that the person has moved on to their next thing. And they have. Don't panic. It just has nothing to do with you. They're going to probably end the interview.
Yeah. So there's two things actually I'd like to go over at the end of the interview. One is the interviewer may ask, is there anything you hoped that we were going to talk about today that we didn't get a chance to talk about? So it's okay if you've covered all the points that you want to cover, or if there's something you wanted to bring up, you can bring it up, but try to bring up positive things, not negative things. So if they didn't ask you about your character and fitness, They want to information than you. So that's one thing, because I've seen that. I used to do that, but I think there are other people that may still do that in different settings. And then the other thing is the questions for the interviewer. So my general rule of thumb for when the interviewer asks you, do you have any questions for me, is to set the interviewer up to brag about their school. You don't want to ask them to compare their school to somebody else.
I've heard this. You have too. Why are you a better fit for me than Vanderbilt? Like, good Lord.
Right. No, I mean, I used to get that question all the time. Like, what's the difference between you and this school? It's like, that's not my job. That's your job.
Right. Exactly.
So set them up to brag about the school. You don't want to ask hard-hitting questions. The person interviewing you may not know the detailed information about a very specific area that you're interested in. You don't want to ask questions that are easily accessible on the website. So think about things that you have questions about and try to think of them in a way that you're pretty sure that the person on the other end is going to be excited to answer.
Right. I like it. Ending on an optimistic note. My final pieces of advice would be yourself. The more organic these conversations go, always the better, never the reverse. So be yourself, be confident, but don't overly brag, because to me, the biggest death knell mostly is over arrogance. There are times, you and I mentioned it, there are a few times where you'll just blank and stare. And even that might, if you recover and say, I totally zoned out, I'm so sorry, this doesn't often happen to me, but I'm going to own up. Even that to me wouldn't be like an auto deny. The auto deny is that, and this has literally happened. Hey, I just got off the phone with a billionaire. I don't need to know that information. And I actually am very skeptical. There's not that many billionaires out there. So organic, don't overbrag, don't overthink post-interview, because you probably did. Experience has shown me, at least, that you've done better than you think you did. In the 22 years I've done admissions and the thousands of people I've talked to the phone, 98% have been completely likable, awesome human beings that should nail an interview unless they get too nervous or feel like they need to brag too much. So 98% of people listening to this are totally fine for the interview process. That would be my takeaway.
That's a good takeaway. The word I like to use for all application materials, including the interview, is be genuine. That goes a long way. If you're a serious person, still try to smile. If you're a goofball,
right.
I mean, you can see 2 49-year-olds here are still super immature.
Right. Well, depending on the target audience, we can rein it in.
We can rein it in. I do want to just say, in my interview experience, being the interviewer, I can give you the times when I remember them blowing it. Just the examples of how far gone you have to be to blow the interview.
Can you give one example?
Yeah.
You can redact a little or give 3 or whatever. Yeah.
I'll give 3. I'll give 3. So, and this is true. These are the 3 that I remember the interview actually making a difference in the overall decision. It was one who made a misogynistic comment to my first question, which is, what's been taking up your time recently? The other was somebody who was coming straight from college. I mean, the reason they asked the question, are you coming straight from college, is really to see, is this the right time for you to law school? And her response, I feel so bad. Like, she got very defensive in her response and really shut down and was unable to answer any other questions that I asked, and gave one-word answers to questions moving forward. So that to me just showed that she really wasn't ready.
Yeah, no different than taking the LSAT and you mess up the first question and you're in your own head and then you can't answer any other question.
Right. And then the last one was somebody who literally could not answer a single question that I asked, and answered all of the questions telling me how much they wanted to go.
I've seen that one too.
It was painful because I could not get him to answer any single question.
At the end of the day, I've yet to hear a law school admissions question that is close to as difficult as like interviewing for a big consulting firm at a business school. Not even remotely close. They're not trying to weed out.
They're not trying to get you.
In fact, I'll use myself as an example. When I hire employees, not it's by consulting, because we generally hire people we know who have been doing this for many years. But when I would hire employees at Colorado Law School or WashU Law School, I was trying to get them because I would have 20 amazing resumes and I'd have to pick one person. Well, let me give you an example of it. Everyone's going to hate me. I would say something like, we caught 12 mistakes on your resume. Can you guess what they were? Actually, I didn't really care about the 12 mistakes that much. I wanted to see how they handled the pressure because I was hiring them for positions where they were going to get a lot of pressure on any given day. The law school interview is going to be nothing like there were 12 mistakes on your resume. What were they? And if they're asking you that, they just want to see how calm you answer. I have no idea what they were, but I'm mad at myself for being sloppy would be the perfect answer. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like if for some reason that came up, you would just be like, yes, that haunts me or something like that. Because it probably does. It probably does.
Always ownership.
Ownership, exactly. But I can tell you that there were a couple times that people thought that they probably messed up and they didn't. The cat photo.
Yeah, you got cat bombed. You admitted them, right?
Admitted her. Yeah, absolutely. I think there was also something online about how the admissions office loved cats for a while after that. I don't know.
Yeah. I know. I used to joke that every third interview, some cat was going to drop off the ceiling into the interview with that.
And then there was somebody, and I don't recommend this. There was somebody who I wasn't sure if they realized they were on camera or not. And I'm just going to say that her sweater looked like a bathrobe, but
they get admitted?
So I don't remember. So that to me means that it didn't really affect the interview.
Exactly. All right. So let's end on this note. Unless you're an extreme outlier, be yourself, be organic.
Absolutely. Be genuine.
Be genuine. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Mike.
We'll talk soon, I suspect.
I'll call you every 5 minutes.
Bye.
Bye.